Welcome, gentle soul, to another quiet visit with the past. In tonight's episode, we'll step into another world, familiar in its humanity, yet distant in time. Maybe you're listening as your thoughts begin to slow, or perhaps you're already resting with heavy eyes. However you found your way here, I'm thankful. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time of day it is for you. The idea of this quiet story floating across the world always makes me smile. If these bedtime journeys through history bring you calm, don't forget to subscribe. There are so many more peaceful nights ahead. Most of us think we know the story of the Salem witch trials. A few young girls accused some townspeople of witchcraft, hysteria spread, and some unfortunate souls were executed before cooler heads prevailed. It's often portrayed as a cautionary tale about superstition triumphing over reason, but this sanitized version barely scratches the surface of what actually happened in Salem Village and the surrounding areas. The truth is far more disturbing, far more complex, and far more revealing about human nature than most people realize. What unfolded in Salem wasn't just a case of religious extremism or adolescent attention-seeking. It was a perfect storm of social tensions, economic disputes, personal vendettas, and psychological manipulation that created a killing machine fueled by fear and sanctioned by the very institutions meant to protect the innocent. Today, we're going to explore why the Salem witch trials were worse than you thought. We'll examine the calculated cruelty of the interrogation methods, the systematic way evidence was manufactured, and how the legal system itself became a weapon against the defenseless. We'll meet the real people behind the famous names and discover how their stories reveal a community that had completely lost its moral compass. But perhaps most disturbing of all, we'll see how the mechanisms that enabled Salem's horror show aren't relics of a bygone era. The same psychological and social forces that turned neighbors into executioners are still with us today, lurking beneath the surface of our supposedly civilized society. The Salem witch trials began in the winter of 1692, when 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, daughter and niece of Salem Village's minister Samuel Parris, began experiencing what their doctor diagnosed as supernatural afflictions. The girls would scream, throw themselves on the ground, contort their bodies into impossible positions, and claim to see specters of witches tormenting them. But here's what most accounts leave out. These weren't random, spontaneous fits. The girls had been experimenting with folk magic, trying to divine their future husbands using an egg white dropped in a glass of water. When their fortune-telling sessions went wrong, possibly producing disturbing or unexpected results, the girls found themselves trapped between their Puritan community's strict prohibitions against such practices and their own fear of punishment. Rather than confess to their forbidden activities, they chose a different path. They began claiming they were victims of witchcraft, transforming themselves from potential sinners into innocent sufferers deserving of sympathy and protection. It was a calculated decision that would ultimately cost 20 people their lives. The first 3 women accused were hardly random choices. Tituba was an enslaved woman from the Caribbean who worked in the Paris household and had likely taught the girls some of the folk magic they'd been practicing. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar who had been asking for charity from Salem families, making her an easy target for a community that viewed poverty as a sign of moral failing. Sarah Osborne was an elderly woman who had scandalized the community by living with a man before marrying him and had been involved in a bitter legal dispute over her late husband's estate. Notice the pattern here. The accusers didn't point fingers at respected community members or people with real power. They chose society's most vulnerable: a slave, a beggar, and a social outcast. These women had no political connections, no economic influence, and no one willing to defend them. They were perfect scapegoats. When these 3 women were arrested and interrogated, something truly sinister began to unfold. The legal system that was supposed to protect the innocent became a machine for manufacturing guilt. The interrogations weren't searches for truth. They were performances designed to extract confessions through psychological torture and manipulation. Magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, who presided over the preliminary examinations, had already decided the accused were guilty before the questioning began. Their job wasn't to determine innocence or guilt, but to force confessions and gather names of other supposed witches. The questioning followed a predictable pattern: leading questions, threats, promises of mercy for cooperation, and the constant presence of the afflicted girls who would convulse and scream whenever an accused person denied the charges. The most chilling aspect of these interrogations was how they were designed to make denial impossible. If you confessed to witchcraft, you lived but had to name other witches. If you maintained your innocence, you were obviously lying because the afflicted girl's suffering proved your guilt. The only way to escape immediate execution was to become complicit in the system by accusing others. Tituba understood this horrible calculus better than anyone. When questioned, she didn't just confess to practicing witchcraft. She spun an elaborate tale of a devil-worship conspiracy involving multiple witches, mysterious men from Boston, and a book signed in blood. Her confession was everything the magistrates wanted to hear: confirmation that a vast supernatural conspiracy was threatening Salem, justification for expanding the investigation, and a roadmap for finding more witches. But Tituba's confession was almost certainly fabricated, a desperate attempt to tell her interrogators what they wanted to hear in order to save her own life. She had learned that in this new reality, truth was whatever the authorities needed it to be, and survival meant becoming an active participant in the lie. The system that emerged from these early interrogations was diabolically efficient. The afflicted girls became the star witnesses, their theatrical fits and accusations treated as infallible evidence of supernatural attack. Anyone who questioned their credibility or suggested natural explanations for their behavior immediately became suspect themselves. The magistrates, convinced they were fighting a cosmic battle between good and evil, abandoned any pretense of fair legal procedure. What made this system particularly insidious was how it weaponized the community's existing tensions and grudges. Salem Village was already fractured by disputes over land, church leadership, and social status. Families that had been feuding for years suddenly had a legal mechanism to destroy their enemies. All you needed was to whisper the right words to the afflicted girls, and your rival could be arrested, interrogated, and potentially executed. The Putnam family, who were among the most vocal supporters of the witch trials, had been locked in bitter disputes with several families that would later find themselves accused of witchcraft. Thomas Putnam's 12-year-old daughter Anne was one of the primary accusers, and it's hard to believe her accusations weren't influenced by the adult grievances swirling around her household. As the trials progressed, the definition of evidence expanded to include increasingly absurd forms of proof. Spectral evidence, where accusers claimed to see the ghostly forms of witches attacking them, became the primary means of conviction. The accused were not allowed to see or cross-examine these spectral attackers, making defense impossible. Physical evidence was equally suspect. Unusual marks on the body became proof of devil's marks. The inability to recite the Lord's Prayer perfectly under extreme stress became evidence of supernatural interference. Even successful prayer was sometimes twisted into proof of guilt, with magistrates claiming the accused were using religious words to cast spells. The touch test, where afflicted persons would allegedly be cured by touching their supposed tormentor, was treated as scientific proof, despite its obvious potential for manipulation. The afflicted girls had every incentive to continue their performances, as they had become the center of attention in a community where young women typically had no voice or power. Perhaps most disturbing was how the legal system abandoned its own principles to accommodate the witch hunt. The normal rules of evidence were suspended. Hearsay became admissible. The testimony of convicted witches was accepted against others, even though these same people were supposedly in league with the father of lies. Defense attorneys were not provided, and those who attempted to advocate for the accused often found themselves under suspicion. The court even accepted evidence that would have been laughable under normal circumstances. When Martha Corey was accused, the afflicted girls claimed they couldn't see what clothes her spectre was wearing because she had blinded them. When investigators went to Corey's house to check her clothing, they found her sitting quietly at home. Rather than taking this as evidence that she couldn't have been attacking the girls, the court decided it proved she was so powerful a witch that she could appear in two places at once. This is what made Salem truly terrifying. It wasn't just a case of superstitious people believing in magic. It was a systematic perversion of justice, where the mechanisms meant to protect the innocent were deliberately corrupted to serve the needs of the accusers and authorities. The witch trials became a perfect machine for converting suspicion into conviction, fear into death sentences, and neighbors into executioners. The speed with which this system consumed lives was breathtaking. Between February and September 1692, over 200 people were accused of witchcraft. 20 were executed, and several more died in the horrific conditions of the local jails while awaiting trial. But these numbers only hint at the true scope of the terror that gripped the community. The psychological torture inflicted on the accused began long before they reached the gallows. Many spent months in chains in overcrowded, unsanitary jails, where disease was rampant and basic necessities were luxuries. Families were forced to pay for their loved ones' imprisonment, adding financial ruin to their emotional devastation. Some accused persons died in jail from the appalling conditions, becoming victims of the witch hunt just as surely as those who were executed. The executions themselves were public spectacles designed to reinforce the community's belief in the righteousness of their cause. But even here, the accused often demonstrated more dignity and faith than their accusers. Many maintained their innocence to the end, forgiving their persecutors and praying for their souls. Their final words often revealed the profound injustice of their situation and the moral bankruptcy of the system that had condemned them. What makes the Salem witch trials worse than most people realize isn't just the number of lives lost or the brutality of the methods used. It's how the entire community became complicit in a system of legalized murder, how institutions that were supposed to protect the innocent became weapons against them, and how quickly civilized people could be transformed into a mob baying for blood. The Salem witch trials reveal something deeply unsettling about human nature and the fragility of justice. They show us how fear can be weaponized, how authority can be corrupted, and how quickly a community can lose its moral compass when caught in the grip of mass hysteria. Most disturbing of all, they remind us that the capacity for such evil doesn't belong to a distant, more primitive past, but lurks within the human heart, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. As we'll explore further, the mechanisms that enabled Salem's horror aren't as foreign to our modern world as we might like to believe. The same psychological forces, social dynamics, and institutional failures that turned Salem into a killing field continue to shape our world today, making the lessons of 1692 more relevant than ever. Looking at your existing script and the reference materials, I'll continue from where you left off. Here's part 2 of your Salem witch trial script. But the psychological torment was only the beginning. The so-called evidence used to convict these accused witches reveals just how far Salem's legal system had descended into madness. Spectral evidence became the cornerstone of prosecution. This meant that if someone claimed they saw the ghost or spirit of the accused tormenting them in a dream, that was considered valid proof in court. Think about that for a moment. Dreams and visions were being used to sentence people to death. The judges, led by William Stoughton, didn't just accept this supernatural testimony. They actively encouraged it. They created an environment where the most outlandish accusations were not only believed, but rewarded. Children who pointed fingers at neighbors were praised for their bravery. Adults who confessed to impossible crimes were spared execution, while those who maintained their innocence faced the gallows. One of the most disturbing aspects was how the trials became a grotesque theater. The afflicted girls would writhe on the courtroom floor, screaming that the accused were pinching them or stabbing them with invisible pins. When the defendant moved their hand, the girls would mirror the motion, claiming they were being forced to copy the witch's movements. The courtroom would erupt in chaos, with spectators gasping and judges nodding gravely as if witnessing genuine supernatural warfare. But here's what makes this even more sinister. These performances were clearly coordinated. The girls had learned that certain behaviors would guarantee the attention and protection of the most powerful men in the colony. They discovered they could destroy anyone they chose simply by pointing and screaming, and the adults who should have protected the innocent instead fed this monster they had created. The speed of the executions was breathtaking. Once accused, defendants had virtually no time to mount a proper defense. Bridget Bishop went from accusation to execution in just 2 months. Others had even less time. The court was operating like a conveyor belt of death, processing cases with ruthless efficiency that prioritized spectacle over justice. What's particularly chilling is how the accusations followed predictable patterns of social prejudice. Women who didn't conform to Puritan ideals of female submission were prime targets. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar who had the audacity to mutter under her breath when refused charity. Sarah Osborne had committed the unforgivable sin of living with a man before marriage. These weren't random accusations. They were targeted character assassinations disguised as holy warfare. The economic motives become even clearer when you examine the property seizures. When someone was accused of witchcraft, their assets were immediately frozen. If they were executed, their property was forfeited to the state. Suddenly, neighbors who had long-standing property disputes found a convenient way to eliminate their rivals. The witch trials became a mechanism for the largest forced wealth transfer in colonial Massachusetts history. Consider the case of George Jacobs Sr., a wealthy farmer who had accumulated significant property over his lifetime. His own granddaughter accused him of witchcraft, but only after he had refused to transfer his land to other family members. Within months, Jacobs was dead, and his property was being divided among those who had testified against him. This wasn't justice. This was legalized theft, sanctified by religious hysteria. The authorities knew exactly what they were doing. Governor William Phipps had initially supported the trials, but when his own wife was accused, he suddenly discovered serious problems with spectral evidence. The moment the accusations reached the upper echelons of colonial society, the entire system began to crumble. It wasn't divine intervention that ended the trials. It was raw political calculation. The aftermath reveals the most damning truth of all. When the hysteria finally ended, there was no reckoning. No systematic investigation into how so many innocent people had been murdered by their own neighbors. Instead, there was a collective amnesia, a desperate attempt to pretend that Salem had been the victim of supernatural forces rather than human evil. The few apologies that came were pathetic exercises in blame shifting. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, eventually acknowledged his error, but only after it became politically safe to do so. The accusers themselves largely escaped any consequences. Ann Putnam Jr., who had been responsible for many of the most dramatic accusations, offered a half-hearted apology years later, claiming she had been deluded by Satan. She never faced trial. She never made restitution. She simply moved on with her life while her victims remained dead. This pattern of deflection reveals the most disturbing aspect of Salem. It wasn't just about superstition or religious extremism. It was about a community's willingness to sacrifice the innocent to protect the guilty. It was about how quickly civilized people can transform into a murderous mob when given permission by authority figures to act on their worst impulses. The Salem witch trials weren't an aberration. They were a preview of how democratic societies can collapse when fear overrides reason, when accusations replace evidence, and when the powerful discover they can manipulate mass hysteria for their own benefit. The scariest thing about Salem isn't that it happened in 1692. It's how easily it could happen again. Looking at your script summary and the reference materials, here's part 3 of your Salem witch trials series. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Salem witch trials wasn't the spectral evidence or the property seizures we've already explored. It was how the very foundations of justice itself were systematically dismantled piece by piece, until what remained was nothing more than a grotesque theatre of predetermined guilt. Picture yourself in that courtroom in 1692. The air thick with tension and fear. You're accused of witchcraft, and you know with absolute certainty that you're innocent. But as you look around that room, you begin to realize something truly terrifying. This isn't actually a trial at all. It's an execution disguised as legal proceedings. The Salem witch trials represented one of the most complete perversions of justice in American history. Every single safeguard that should have protected the innocent was either ignored, twisted, or weaponized against them. And the truly horrifying part, the people running these trials knew exactly what they were doing. Let's start with the most fundamental corruption, the burden of proof. In any legitimate legal system, the accusers must prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. But in Salem, this was flipped entirely on its head. The accused had to prove their innocence. And here's the sick joke. How exactly do you prove you're not a witch? How do you prove you didn't send your spirit to torment someone in their dreams? How do you prove you didn't make a pact with the devil when no one was watching? The answer is simple. You can't. And that was the point. The court had created a perfect trap. Deny the charges? Well, that's exactly what a witch would do. Confess, guilty as charged. Provide an alibi. Your spirit could travel anywhere while your body stayed put. Call character witnesses? They're probably witches too, or they're lying to protect you. Sarah Good discovered this impossible situation firsthand. When Magistrate John Hathorne demanded she confess to tormenting children, she maintained her innocence. His response was chilling in its circular logic. Sarah Good, do you not see now what you have done? Why do you not tell us the truth? Why do you thus torment these poor children? When Good continued to deny the charges, Hathorne pressed further. Who do you employ then to do it? Good's honest answer, I employ nobody, was twisted into evidence of guilt. After all, if she wasn't employing anyone else, she must be doing it herself. This wasn't incompetence. This was a deliberate strategy. The magistrates had abandoned any pretense of seeking truth. They had already decided these people were guilty, and the trials were simply a formality to justify the executions they had already planned. But the corruption went deeper than just shifting the burden of proof. The court had also completely abandoned the standards for admissible evidence. In legitimate legal proceedings, evidence must be reliable, verifiable, and relevant. In Salem, the court accepted the most absurd and unprovable claims as absolute fact. Dreams were presented as evidence. Visions were treated as eyewitness testimony. Spectral sightings, claims that someone's spirit had been seen causing harm while their physical body was elsewhere, were not only accepted, but became the primary form of evidence used to secure convictions. Think about how insane this really was. Imagine if modern courts operated this way. Your Honor, I had a dream that the defendant robbed a bank. Well, that settles it. Guilty as charged. But it gets worse. The court didn't just passively accept this nonsense. They actively encouraged it. When the afflicted girls would have their fits in the courtroom, writhing and screaming and claiming to see invisible spectres, the magistrates would play along with this theatre. They would ask the accusers to describe what they were seeing. They would demand the accused explain why their spectre was tormenting these poor children. They would even order the accused to call back their spirits, as if this were all perfectly normal and reasonable. During Bridget Bishop's trial, the afflicted claimed her spectre was pinching and choking them. Instead of questioning the reliability of such claims, Magistrate Hathorne asked Bishop, "Why do you seem to act witchcraft before us, by the motion of your body?" When Bishop naturally denied doing anything, Hathorne responded, "Is it not your coat that hurts them?" Your coat. They were seriously suggesting that a piece of clothing could commit assault through supernatural means. And this wasn't treated as a joke or a moment of temporary insanity. This was presented as legitimate evidence in a capital murder trial. The accused weren't even allowed to defend themselves properly. When they tried to speak, they were shouted down. When they questioned the accusers, they were told they were being disrespectful to the afflicted. When they pointed out the logical impossibilities in the charges, they were accused of being argumentative and uncooperative. Martha Corey made the mistake of expressing skepticism about the witch trials before she herself was accused. When she pointed out that the afflicted girls could simply be lying or mistaken, this skepticism was later used as evidence of her guilt. After all, who but a witch would try to discredit witch trials? The court had created a system where any attempt to defend yourself was treated as further evidence of guilt. Speak too little, and you're being evasive. Speak too much, and you're being manipulative. Show emotion, and you're revealing your evil nature. Stay calm, and you're displaying the cold heart of a witch. But perhaps the most sickening aspect of these trials was how they encouraged and rewarded false confessions. In most legal systems, a confession is the end of the process. You confess, you're punished, case closed. But in Salem, confession was treated as the beginning of cooperation. Those who confessed weren't executed. Instead, they were pressured to name their accomplices. They were asked to describe their interactions with the devil. They were encouraged to elaborate on their crimes and implicate others. The more names they provided, the more their own lives were spared. This created a perverse incentive structure. The innocent were executed for maintaining their innocence, while the guilty, or rather, those willing to lie about their guilt, were kept alive as long as they continued to feed the machine with new accusations. Tituba, the enslaved woman whose initial testimony helped spark the hysteria, understood this dynamic perfectly. Her confession was elaborate and detailed, filled with descriptions of devil worship and supernatural encounters. She named other witches and described their activities in vivid detail. And as a result, she was one of the few accused who survived the trials. Meanwhile, Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother known throughout the community for her piety and charity, was executed because she refused to confess to crimes she didn't commit. John Proctor, a successful farmer with no history of supernatural activities, was hanged because he wouldn't lie about making a pact with the devil. The message was clear. Truth was irrelevant. The court didn't care about actual guilt or innocence. They cared about compliance, cooperation, and the continued feeding of their witch-hunting machine. This corruption was so systematic and thorough that it's impossible to view it as accidental. The magistrates weren't bumbling fools who got carried away by superstition. They were intelligent men who deliberately chose to abandon every principle of justice in service of their own goals. Consider the case of George Burroughs, the former minister who was accused of being the ringleader of the witches. Burroughs had enemies in Salem who resented his past conflicts with the community. When he was arrested in Maine and brought back for trial, the evidence against him was particularly thin, even by Salem standards. But rather than demanding better evidence, the court simply lowered their standards even further. They accepted testimony that Burroughs possessed supernatural strength, based on claims that he could lift heavy objects. They treated his ability to recite Psalm 23 perfectly, while standing on the gallows, as evidence that he was using witchcraft to appear innocent. The crowd at his execution was actually moved by his dignified behavior and perfect recitation of the prayer. Many began to doubt his guilt. But Cotton Mather, one of the prominent ministers supporting the trials, quickly addressed the crowd and reminded them that the devil could transform himself into an angel of light. In other words, appearing innocent was just more proof of guilt. This is the level of intellectual dishonesty we're dealing with. The court had created a system where literally any piece of evidence could be twisted to support a predetermined conclusion of guilt. Good behavior, the devil in disguise. Bad behavior, clear evidence of evil. No evidence at all. Proof of how sneaky and dangerous the witch really was. The trials had become a machine designed not to determine guilt or innocence, but to transform accusations into executions as efficiently as possible. And the truly horrifying part is how many people were willing to participate in this charade. The magistrates who perverted the law, the ministers who provided theological justification for the corruption, the accusers who knew their claims were false but continued making them anyway, the community members who went along with the hysteria rather than speak out against it. By the time the Salem witch trials ended, 20 innocent people were dead. Hundreds more had been imprisoned, often in conditions so horrible that some died in jail. Families were destroyed. Reputations were ruined. Property was seized. And an entire community was traumatized by their participation in what can only be described as legalized murder. But perhaps the most chilling legacy of Salem isn't the death toll or the property damage. It's the precedent it set for how quickly and completely a society can abandon its principles when fear takes hold. How easily the machinery of justice can be transformed into an instrument of persecution. How willing ordinary people can be to participate in atrocities as long as they're given official sanction and social approval. The Salem witch trials weren't an aberration or an accident. They were the logical result of a society that chose fear over reason, conformity over conscience, and expedience over justice. And the lessons of Salem remain as relevant today as they were over 3 centuries ago, serving as a permanent warning about the fragility of the values we claim to hold dear. Looking at your existing script, parts 1 through 3, I'll continue with part 4, maintaining the same tone and style while advancing the narrative about the Salem witch trials. Here's part 4. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the Salem witch trials wasn't just the corrupted legal system or the fabricated evidence. It was how the accusations themselves became a weapon of social warfare, wielded by those seeking to settle old scores and eliminate inconvenient neighbors. The finger-pointing wasn't random chaos. It was strategic, calculated, and devastatingly effective. Consider the case of Martha Corey, a woman whose only crime was expressing skepticism about the witch trials themselves. When the initial accusations began flying in 1692, Corey made the fatal mistake of suggesting that the afflicted girls might be lying or mistaken. She questioned whether spectral evidence could be trusted in a court of law. For this act of reasonable doubt, she was immediately branded a witch herself. The message was clear: dissent would not be tolerated. The accusers had stumbled upon the perfect system of social control. Anyone who questioned the proceedings could instantly become a target. It was a self-reinforcing cycle of terror that made opposition virtually impossible. Speak out against the trials, and you'd find yourself in chains within days. The community was effectively held hostage by its own fear. What made this system particularly cruel was how it exploited existing social tensions that had been simmering for years. Salem Village was already fractured by disputes over land, church leadership, and economic competition. families had been feuding for decades over property lines and inheritance rights. The witch trials simply provided a convenient mechanism to weaponize these grievances. Take the case of Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother who was widely respected in the community for her piety and good works. But the Nurse family had been embroiled in a bitter land dispute with their neighbors, the Putnams. When young Ann Putnam Jr. began having fits and claimed to see Rebecca Nurse's spectre tormenting her, it wasn't supernatural intervention. It was the Putnam family using the witch trials to destroy their enemies through legal means. The pattern becomes even clearer when you map out the accusations geographically. The majority of the accused lived on the eastern side of Salem village, while most of the accusers lived on the western side. This wasn't coincidence. The two areas had been locked in a political and economic struggle for control of the village for years. The witch trials became the ultimate expression of this conflict, with one faction literally trying to eliminate the other. But the social weaponization of witchcraft accusations went beyond mere property disputes. The trials also served as a brutal form of patriarchal control, particularly targeting women who didn't conform to expected social roles. Many of the accused were widows who had inherited property, women who ran businesses, or those who had somehow challenged male authority. In a society where women were expected to be silent and submissive, any display of independence could be reframed as evidence of diabolic influence. Bridget Bishop, the first person executed in Salem, was a perfect example of this dynamic. She operated a tavern, wore colorful clothing, and had been married 3 times. She was exactly the kind of woman who threatened the rigid social order that the Puritan community was trying to maintain. Her execution sent a clear message to other women about the consequences of stepping out of line. The accusers also discovered they could use the trials to eliminate economic competition. Martha Carrier was accused partly because her family's success in farming had made neighbors jealous and resentful. John Proctor was targeted after he criticized the trials and threatened the economic interests of those profiting from the confiscated property of the accused. The witch trials had become a grotesque form of hostile takeover, allowing people to destroy their rivals while claiming divine justification. Perhaps most disturbing was how the trials created an economy of accusation. The court officials, the jailers, the sheriffs who seized property, even the ministers who provided spiritual guidance to the accused. All of them had financial incentives to keep the trials going. Each new accusation meant more fees, more confiscated property to divide up, more power to wield. The system had created its own marketplace of human misery. The psychological manipulation was equally sophisticated. The afflicted girls had learned they could command attention, sympathy, and power through their performances. In a society where young women had virtually no agency, the trials offered them an intoxicating taste of influence. They could bring down respected adults, disrupt court proceedings, and hold entire communities in thrall with their dramatic fits and accusations. But this power came at a terrible cost. The girls were trapped in their own web of lies, forced to maintain increasingly elaborate performances to avoid being exposed as frauds. Some of them later expressed regret for their role in the trials, but by then it was too late. 20 people were dead, and countless others had been destroyed by the accusations. The trials also revealed how quickly a community could turn on itself when fear overrode reason. Neighbors who had lived peacefully together for decades suddenly became mortal enemies. Children were encouraged to testify against their own parents. Husbands accused wives, and wives accused husbands. The social fabric of Salem was completely shredded by suspicion and paranoia. What's particularly chilling is how normal people became complicit in this system of destruction. It wasn't just a few evil individuals orchestrating everything. Ordinary citizens served on juries that convicted the innocent. Neighbors provided testimony that sent people to their deaths. Community members attended the executions as public entertainment. The trials succeeded because they turned an entire society into accomplices. The speed with which things escalated was breathtaking. In just over a year, what began as a handful of girls having fits had mushroomed into a reign of terror that consumed the entire region. More than 200 people were accused, 20 were executed, and several more died in prison awaiting trial. The trials had taken on a life of their own, growing more vicious and indiscriminate with each passing month. And through it all, the authorities maintained the fiction that they were serving justice and protecting the community from supernatural evil. They wrapped their persecution in the language of law and order, claiming they were simply following proper legal procedures. But behind the veneer of official process was a system designed to crush anyone who stood in the way of those in power. The Salem witch trials weren't an aberration or a historical curiosity. They were a masterclass in how fear can be manufactured, manipulated, and weaponized to serve the interests of those who know how to exploit it. The techniques used in Salem, the manufactured evidence, the coerced confessions, the social pressure to conform, the economic incentives for accusation, these are tactics that have been repeated throughout history whenever societies have decided that certain groups of people are expendable. What happened in Salem was worse than we thought because it revealed something fundamental about human nature and social dynamics. It showed how quickly civilization can collapse when fear overrides justice, when accusation becomes more powerful than evidence, and when the machinery of law becomes a tool of oppression rather than protection. The real horror of Salem wasn't supernatural. It was entirely, devastatingly human. Boring history. Why the Salem witch trials were worse than you thought, Part 5. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Salem witch trials wasn't just the corrupted legal system or the economic exploitation. It was how ordinary neighbors turned against each other with a viciousness that would make medieval inquisitors blush. The social fabric of Salem village had been unraveling for years before 1692, and the witch trials became the perfect vehicle for settling old scores, destroying reputations, and eliminating inconvenient people from the community. Consider the case of Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother who was by all accounts one of the most respected women in Salem village. She was known for her piety, her charitable work, and her gentle demeanor. When she was first accused of witchcraft, even the magistrates seemed skeptical. But the accusers persisted, claiming that Nurse's spectre had tormented them mercilessly. What made Nurse such a target? Her family had been embroiled in a bitter land dispute with the Putnam family for decades. Thomas Putnam's wife, Anne Putnam Sr., was one of the most vocal accusers in the trials. Suddenly, the accusations against Rebecca Nurse make perfect sense. This wasn't about witchcraft at all, but about settling a generational feud through the most brutal means available. The trials created an atmosphere where suspicion poisoned every interaction. Neighbors who had lived peacefully side by side for years suddenly saw each other as potential threats. A harsh word, a failed recipe, even a sideways glance could be interpreted as evidence of malevolent supernatural power. The accusers, many of them young girls who had initially seemed to be genuine victims, quickly discovered that their claims carried enormous weight. They could point a finger at anyone and watch as that person's life was destroyed. The power was intoxicating, and they wielded it with increasing boldness. Take the case of George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem village who had left under contentious circumstances years earlier. When the trials began, the accusers claimed that Burroughs was not just a witch, but the leader of all the witches in New England, a kind of diabolic high priest, orchestrating the supernatural assault on Salem. The evidence against him was laughably thin. He was unusually strong for his size. He could recite scripture from memory, and he had been married multiple times after his wives died. In any rational court, these would hardly constitute proof of witchcraft. But in Salem, they were enough to send him to the gallows. Burroughs' real crime wasn't consorting with the devil. It was having made enemies during his turbulent tenure as village minister. The psychological warfare didn't stop with formal accusations. The mere threat of being named as a witch was enough to terrorize the population into submission. People began modifying their behavior, avoiding certain individuals, and carefully monitoring their own actions to avoid giving any appearance of supernatural involvement. The accused were often pressured by family members to confess, not because anyone believed they were actually witches, but because confession was the only path to survival. This created a perverse incentive structure where lying became a virtue and truth became a death sentence. Martha Corey's case illustrates just how impossible the situation had become for the accused. Corey was a church member known for her skepticism about the witch trials. She had publicly questioned whether the afflicted girls were genuine, suggesting instead that they were either deluded or deliberately deceptive. This rational response to an irrational situation sealed her fate. The accusers immediately claimed that Corey's spectre was tormenting them, and her previous skepticism was reframed as evidence that she was trying to protect her fellow witches. When she was examined, Corey maintained her innocence and continued to express doubt about the entire proceedings. The magistrates took this as further proof of her guilt. After all, only a witch would question the godly work of exposing witchcraft. The trials also revealed the deep misogyny that ran through Puritan society like a poisonous river. While men were certainly accused and executed, the vast majority of the accused were women, and the nature of the accusations often focused on behaviors that challenged traditional gender roles. Women who were too independent, too outspoken, or too successful in business were prime targets. Bridget Bishop, the first person executed in the Salem trials, was a tavern keeper who dressed flamboyantly and had been married multiple times. She was everything that Puritan society taught women not to be: independent, sexually confident, and financially successful. Her execution sent a clear message to other women about the consequences of stepping outside prescribed social boundaries. But the trials weren't just about punishing individual women. They were about reinforcing an entire system of patriarchal control. The young female accusers, who might seem to have gained power through their role in the trials, were actually being used as instruments of that same patriarchal system. Their accusations were taken seriously only when they aligned with existing social tensions and power structures. When some of the girls later tried to accuse members of prominent families like the Mathers, their claims were suddenly dismissed as unreliable. The message was clear: women's voices mattered only when they served the interests of powerful men. The economic dimensions of the trials became even more sinister when we examine the pattern of property seizure. When someone was accused of witchcraft, their assets were often frozen pending the outcome of their trial. If they were executed, their property was forfeited to the crown. This created a direct financial incentive for accusations, particularly against wealthy individuals. Sheriff George Corwin became notorious for his zealous seizure of property from the accused, stripping families of their homes, livestock, and possessions even before trials were concluded. Some families were left destitute, forced to flee Salem to escape both accusation and financial ruin. The case of Philip English illustrates how wealth could make someone a target. English was one of Salem's most successful merchants, with extensive holdings in ships, warehouses, and real estate. When he and his wife were accused of witchcraft, they fled to New York, but Sheriff Corwin seized virtually all of their property. The accusations against English were particularly flimsy. He was said to have appeared spectrally at witch meetings, but there were no other substantial claims against him. His real crime was being successful enough to attract envy and wealthy enough to make his destruction profitable. The psychological toll of the trials extended far beyond those who were directly accused. Families were torn apart as relatives turned against each other, either out of genuine belief or out of fear for their own safety. Children were forced to testify against parents, spouses against each other, and siblings against siblings. The community that had once been bound together by shared faith and mutual dependence became a collection of isolated individuals, each terrified of being the next target. The afflicted girls themselves became trapped in a web of their own making. As the trials progressed, their performances became increasingly elaborate and dramatic. They would fall into convulsions during examinations, claim to see invisible specters attacking them, and provide detailed descriptions of supernatural torments. But maintaining these performances required constant escalation. Each new accusation had to be more dramatic than the last to maintain credibility. The girls found themselves in a kind of performative arms race, where backing down would mean admitting fraud and potentially facing severe punishment themselves. Some historians have suggested that the girls may have initially been genuine victims of some form of mass hysteria, or even poisoning from ergot-contaminated grain. But regardless of how it started, the phenomenon quickly became something else entirely, a calculated campaign of destruction that served the interests of powerful individuals while destroying the lives of the vulnerable. The girls' initial suffering, whether real or imagined, was exploited by adults who saw an opportunity to settle scores and consolidate power. The role of spectral evidence in the trials cannot be overstated in its perversity. This was evidence that only the accusers could see. Claims that the spectre or ghostly form of the accused was tormenting them invisibly. There was literally no way to disprove such evidence. If an accused person had an alibi, showing they were miles away when the alleged supernatural attack occurred, it didn't matter. Their spectre could travel anywhere instantaneously. If they were locked in jail, their spectre could still escape to torment the afflicted. This created a situation where accusation was tantamount to conviction, since the evidence was by definition invisible and unprovable. The magistrate's handling of spectral evidence reveals either stunning gullibility or willful participation in a corrupt system. Increase Mather, one of the most prominent ministers in Massachusetts, initially warned against relying too heavily on spectral evidence, noting that the devil might use the spectre of an innocent person to commit evil acts. But his warnings were largely ignored in the heat of the trials. It wasn't until the trials began threatening members of the colonial elite that spectral evidence was suddenly deemed unreliable. When the accusers began pointing fingers at people like Lady Phipps, the governor's wife, the rules of evidence mysteriously became much more stringent. The trials also exposed the deep class divisions that ran through Massachusetts society. While poor women like Sarah Good were quickly condemned and executed, wealthy and well-connected accused individuals often managed to escape or delay their trials long enough for the hysteria to subside. The message was unmistakable. Justice in Salem was for sale, and the price of innocence was social status and political connections. But perhaps most damning of all was the complete abandonment of legal protections that were supposedly fundamental to English jurisprudence. The accused were denied the right to legal counsel, the right to confront their accusers in any meaningful way, and the right to a fair trial before an impartial jury. Instead, they faced hostile magistrates who seemed determined to extract confessions regardless of guilt or innocence. The presumption of innocence, that bedrock principle of justice, was completely reversed. The accused were guilty until proven innocent, and in many cases, proving innocence was literally impossible. The coercive methods used to extract confessions would be familiar to any student of totalitarian regimes. Sleep deprivation, psychological pressure, threats against family members, and promises of leniency in exchange for confession were all standard tactics. Some accused individuals were subjected to prayer tests, where they were forced to recite religious passages perfectly. Any stumble or hesitation was taken as evidence of diabolic interference. Others were subjected to physical tests, like the notorious touch test. where accusers would supposedly be cured of their fits if touched by the witch who was tormenting them. The speed with which the trials proceeded left no time for careful consideration of evidence or proper legal procedures. From the first accusations in February 1692 to the last executions in September, the entire ordeal lasted less than 8 months. In that brief span, hundreds of people were accused, dozens were imprisoned under horrific conditions, and 20 were killed. The breakneck pace served the interests of those orchestrating the trials, preventing any organized opposition from forming and maintaining the atmosphere of crisis that justified extraordinary measures. As we examine these trials from our modern perspective, it's tempting to dismiss them as the product of a more superstitious and ignorant age. But that interpretation misses the point entirely. The Salem witch trials weren't a failure of reason. They were a successful implementation of a system designed to eliminate opposition and consolidate power. The superstition was just the excuse, the mechanism by which rational actors pursued very real political and economic goals. The true horror of Salem wasn't that people believed in witches, but that they used that belief as a weapon against their neighbors. The legacy of Salem extends far beyond colonial Massachusetts. The trials serve as a chilling reminder of how quickly a society can abandon its principles when fear and opportunism converge. They show us how institutions designed to protect the innocent can be perverted to serve the interests of the powerful. Most importantly, they demonstrate the terrible human cost of allowing hysteria to override reason and justice to be sacrificed on the altar of political expedience. The men and women who died at Salem weren't victims of superstition. They were victims of a calculated campaign of terror that used religious belief as a cover for the most base human motivations: greed, revenge, and the lust for power. Their deaths weren't tragic accidents, but murders carried out under the color of law by people who knew exactly what they were doing. That's what makes the Salem witch trials not just a historical curiosity, but a warning that echoes across the centuries, reminding us that the capacity for evil doesn't require belief in the supernatural. It only requires the willingness to exploit the fears and prejudices of others for personal gain. And perhaps most chilling of all, the mechanisms that made Salem possible: fear of the other, the abandonment of legal protections, the weaponization of accusations, and the corruption of institutions. These aren't relics of the distant past. They're tools that ambitious and unscrupulous individuals have used throughout history and continue to use today. The faces change, the specific beliefs evolve, but the underlying dynamics remain disturbingly familiar. Salem wasn't an aberration. It was a template, one that has been followed again and again whenever societies choose fear over reason, expedience over justice, and power over truth. The Salem witch trials of 1692 to 1693 reveal a devastating example of how fear, power, and systemic corruption can transform a community into an instrument of terror. As we've seen, what began as mysterious afflictions in Salem Village quickly spiraled into a judicial nightmare where the most vulnerable members of society became targets in a deadly game of accusation and execution. But the true horror of Salem extends far beyond the 20 lives lost. It lies in how completely the trials dismantled the very foundations of justice and community trust. When spectral evidence became admissible in court, when the accused were denied legal representation, when confession became the only path to survival, Salem transformed from a place of supposed moral purity into a theater of systematic oppression. The trials reveal how quickly civilized society can collapse when fear overrides reason. Neighbors who had lived side by side for decades suddenly viewed each other with suspicion. Children became instruments of destruction, their accusations carrying the weight of life and death. The very institutions meant to protect the innocent, the courts, and the church, became mechanisms of persecution. What makes Salem particularly chilling is how the accusations followed predictable patterns of social vulnerability. The first targets weren't chosen randomly. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar. Sarah Osborne, involved in a scandalous relationship. Tituba, an enslaved woman from Barbados. These women occupied the margins of Puritan society, making them perfect scapegoats for a community desperate to explain the unexplainable. As the hysteria spread, the net widened to ensnare anyone who dared question the proceedings, or who simply found themselves on the wrong side of old grudges. Property disputes, business rivalries, and personal vendettas all found expression through witchcraft accusations. The trials became a weapon that could be wielded by anyone clever enough to manipulate the system. The financial incentives that drove the witch hunt are particularly disturbing. When the property of the accused could be seized, when court officials were paid for each case they processed, when informants could benefit from their accusations, justice became a commodity to be bought and sold. The trials weren't just about supernatural fears. They were about very earthly concerns: money, land, and power. Perhaps most tragically, the Salem witch trials demonstrate how good people can become complicit in evil when swept up by collective hysteria. Many of the accusers, judges, and spectators weren't inherently malicious. They genuinely believed they were protecting their community from a supernatural threat. But their certainty, combined with their willingness to abandon due process and rational inquiry, made them participants in a system that destroyed innocent lives. The psychological tactics employed during the trials, forced confessions under threat of execution, the use of children as witnesses, the acceptance of unprovable spectral evidence, created an environment where truth became impossible to distinguish from fiction. In such a system, innocence offered no protection. The only safety lay in confession, in playing along with the delusion, in becoming part of the machinery of persecution. The aftermath of Salem was almost as telling as the trials themselves. When the hysteria finally broke, when respected members of the community found themselves accused, when the governor's own wife came under suspicion, suddenly the entire edifice collapsed. The same officials who had zealously pursued witches now scrambled to distance themselves from their actions. The same spectral evidence that had sent 20 people to their deaths was suddenly deemed unreliable. But the damage was irreversible. Families had been destroyed, communities fractured, and an entire generation traumatized. The survivors carried the scars of Salem for the rest of their lives, a reminder of how quickly the world could turn upside down, how easily neighbors could become enemies, how fragile the bonds of civilization truly were. The Salem witch trials serve as a permanent warning about the dangers of abandoning rational thought in favor of fear-driven certainty. They show us how quickly justice can be perverted when we allow emotion to override evidence, when we permit the vulnerable to be sacrificed for the comfort of the powerful, when we mistake hysteria for righteousness. In our modern world, we might think ourselves immune to such collective madness. We have constitutional protections, scientific understanding, and historical awareness that the people of Salem lacked. But the underlying human tendencies that enabled the witch trials, fear of the other, desire for simple explanations to complex problems, willingness to believe rumors over evidence, susceptibility to moral panic, these remain as potent today as they were over 3 centuries ago. Salem reminds us that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance, not just against external threats, but against our own capacity for cruelty when we convince ourselves that cruelty serves a righteous cause. The true lesson of Salem isn't about witches or the supernatural. It's about the terrifying ease with which ordinary people can become instruments of injustice when they surrender their individual moral judgment to the mob. The 20 victims of Salem died not because they practiced witchcraft, but because they lived in a society that had lost its way, that had allowed fear to triumph over compassion, superstition over reason, and vengeance over justice. Their deaths stand as a testament to the consequences of abandoning the principles that separate civilization from barbarism. And their memory serves as a warning that such abandonment can happen anywhere, anytime, to anyone who believes themselves immune to the darkness that lurks within human nature. Looking at the summary and reference files, I'll continue the script from where Part 6 left off, focusing on how the Salem witch trials exploited psychological vulnerabilities and social dynamics to perpetuate the hysteria. But perhaps most chilling of all was how the Salem witch trials revealed humanity's capacity for psychological manipulation and collective delusion. The accusers didn't simply point fingers randomly. They weaponized the deepest fears and anxieties of their community, turning neighbor against neighbor through a systematic campaign of terror that would make modern propagandists envious. The afflicted girls, led by Abigail Williams and Mercy Lewis, had stumbled upon something more powerful than any spell or potion. They had discovered that in a society built on rigid hierarchies and suppressed tensions, the right accusation at the right moment could topple entire families and reshape the social order. These weren't random outbursts of teenage hysteria. These were calculated performances designed to exploit every psychological weakness in Puritan society. Consider how the girls chose their targets. They began with Tituba, an enslaved woman from Barbados whose foreign origins and different cultural practices made her an easy scapegoat. They moved on to Sarah Good, a homeless beggar whose poverty and social isolation had already made her an outcast. Then came Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had violated social norms by living with a man before marriage. Each accusation was a carefully chosen arrow aimed at society's most vulnerable members. But the genius of their manipulation lay in how they gradually escalated their targets. Once the community had accepted that outcasts could be witches, the girls began accusing more respectable citizens. They understood that credibility was cumulative. Each successful accusation made the next one more believable. Each execution created a precedent that made the next death easier to justify. The girls had also mastered the art of spectral evidence, that twisted legal concept that allowed dreams and visions to be treated as courtroom testimony. They would writhe and scream in court, claiming to see the invisible specters of the accused tormenting them. When challenged, they had the perfect defense. How could anyone disprove what they claimed to see in the spirit world? How could the accused defend themselves against crimes that existed only in the supernatural realm? This wasn't just legal innovation, it was psychological warfare. The girls had created a system where accusation was tantamount to conviction, where defense was impossible, and where the very act of protesting one's innocence could be twisted into evidence of guilt. They had discovered that in a society consumed by fear of the invisible and unknowable, the power to interpret the supernatural was the ultimate authority. The community's response reveals just how vulnerable human psychology can be to mass manipulation. Rational, educated men like Samuel Parris and Cotton Mather, who should have been skeptical of teenage girls claiming supernatural powers, instead became their most ardent supporters. They transformed what should have been obvious adolescent attention-seeking into a holy crusade against Satan himself. The trials also exploited a fundamental flaw in human reasoning, the confirmation bias that made every strange event, every unexplained illness, every bit of bad luck into evidence of witchcraft. When Martha Corey's accusation was followed by her husband's sudden illness, it wasn't seen as coincidence or stress-related sickness. It was proof of her supernatural malevolence. When storms struck during witch trials, they weren't natural weather patterns, but demonic interference designed to protect the guilty. This selective interpretation of evidence created a closed system of belief that was immune to contradiction. Good harvests meant God was blessing their efforts to root out evil. Bad harvests meant the witches were still among them, requiring more vigorous prosecution. Confessions proved the reality of witchcraft. Denials proved the stubbornness of Satan's servants. The system had been designed to validate itself no matter what happened. Perhaps most disturbing was how the trials exploited the psychological need for meaning and order in a chaotic world. The Puritans lived in constant fear of Indian attacks, disease outbreaks, and economic collapse. The witch trials offered them something precious in such uncertain times: clear explanations for their suffering and concrete actions they could take to protect themselves. Instead of accepting that bad things sometimes happen for no reason, they could blame witches. Instead of feeling helpless against forces beyond their control, they could fight back by identifying and eliminating the supernatural threats in their midst. The girls had tapped into something primal in human nature: the desperate need to believe that someone is in control, even if that someone is evil. It was more comforting to think that their problems were caused by witches who could be caught and killed than to accept the terrifying reality that life was often random, unfair, and beyond human control. The trials also revealed how quickly social bonds could dissolve under pressure. Neighbors who had lived peacefully together for decades suddenly saw each other as potential threats. Friends became informants. Family members turned against each other. The girls had created an atmosphere where trust itself became dangerous, where any relationship could be weaponized, where isolation was safer than community. They understood that in a society built on shame and reputation, the mere accusation of witchcraft was often punishment enough. Even those who escaped execution found their lives destroyed, their businesses ruined, their social connections severed. The trials had created a new form of social control, where the threat of accusation kept everyone in line, where conformity became a matter of life and death. The psychological manipulation extended to the confessions themselves. The accused faced an impossible choice: maintain their innocence and face almost certain execution, or confess to crimes they didn't commit and save their lives while destroying their souls. Many chose confession, not because they believed they were guilty, but because they understood the game being played. Their false confessions then became evidence used to convict others, creating a snowball effect of manufactured guilt. This wasn't just legal proceeding. It was psychological torture designed to break down individual resistance and create a culture of compliance. The girls and their adult supporters had created a system where survival required complicity, where the only way to escape becoming a victim was to help create new victims. The most chilling aspect of this psychological manipulation was how it transformed ordinary people into accomplices. Neighbors who might normally have been skeptical of outrageous accusations found themselves nodding along in court. Parents who should have protected their children instead delivered them to the executioner. Community leaders who should have demanded evidence instead accepted wild speculation as fact. The girls had achieved something that military conquests and political revolutions often fail to accomplish. They had changed how an entire community thought about reality itself. They had made the impossible seem inevitable, the irrational seem logical, the cruel seem necessary. They had weaponized the human capacity for self-deception and turned it against their own neighbors. As the months passed and the body count mounted, some began to question what they had unleashed. But by then, too many people had too much invested in the system to allow it to collapse. Judges who had sentenced innocent people to death couldn't admit their error without destroying their own reputations. Ministers who had preached about the reality of the witch conspiracy couldn't reverse course without undermining their spiritual authority. Accusers who had sent neighbors to their deaths couldn't confess to lies without facing retaliation from the families they had destroyed. The Salem witch trials had created their own momentum, a machine of destruction that fed on fear, suspicion, and the very human tendency to double down on mistakes rather than admit error. The girls had lit a fire that no one knew how to extinguish, a psychological conflagration that would consume the innocent and guilty alike until it finally burned itself out through sheer exhaustion. This manipulation of mass psychology reveals perhaps the darkest truth about Salem. It wasn't supernatural forces that created the tragedy, but purely human ones. The real evil wasn't in the accused witches' supposed pacts with Satan, but in the accuser's very real ability to exploit human weakness, fear, and cruelty for their own ends. The true horror of Salem lies not in what people believed, but in what they were willing to do to each other once those beliefs took hold. Based on the reference materials provided, here's Part 8 of the Salem Witch Trials script, in the engaging narrative style shown in the examples. As the trials progressed into their bloodiest phase, a chilling pattern emerged that revealed the true horror of Salem's descent into madness. The accused faced a system so thoroughly corrupted that survival became nearly impossible, no matter how innocent they might be. The very foundations of justice had been twisted into a machine designed not to discover truth, but to extract confessions and deliver death sentences. Consider the nightmarish position of someone dragged before these courts. You're accused of consorting with the devil, practicing witchcraft, or tormenting your neighbors through supernatural means. The evidence against you? Perhaps a teenage girl claims she saw your specter pinching her in a dream. Maybe a neighbor insists their cow stopped giving milk after you walked past their property. Or someone testifies that you looked at them strangely before they developed a headache. In any rational legal system, such accusations would be laughed out of court. But Salem, in 1692, had abandoned rationality entirely. The judges not only accepted this spectral evidence as legitimate, they treated it as the most compelling proof available. When Bridget Bishop stood trial as the first person executed in the witch trials, the primary evidence against her consisted of testimony that her spectre had appeared to various accusers in their dreams and visions. There was no physical evidence, no witnesses to actual witchcraft, no tangible proof of any crime whatsoever. Yet this became the standard that would condemn 20 people to death. The examination process itself was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation designed to break down the accused. Picture yourself in that sweltering meeting house, standing before a panel of stern-faced magistrates, while a crowd of hostile neighbors packs the room behind you. The accusers, mostly young women, begin writhing and screaming the moment you're brought in, claiming that your very presence is tormenting them. Judge William Stoughton, the Chief Justice who would become the most ruthless figure in the trials, developed particularly insidious techniques for extracting confessions. He would demand that you explain why these girls were suffering if you weren't afflicting them. When you inevitably couldn't provide a satisfactory answer to this impossible question, he would treat your confusion as evidence of guilt. The touch test became one of the most perverse elements of these examinations. The theory held that if a witch touched their victim, the supernatural torment would cease, so the accused would be forced to place their hands on the writhing accusers. When the girls stopped their theatrical fits at the moment of contact, this was presented as definitive proof of witchcraft. Of course, the accusers controlled this supposed test entirely, choosing when to continue or stop their performances based on the desired outcome. But perhaps most insidiously, the judges created a system where confession became both salvation and damnation. Those who confessed to witchcraft were typically spared execution, at least temporarily. They could save their lives by admitting to crimes they never committed. However, these confessions came with a terrible price. The confessor was then expected to name accomplices, to identify other witches in the community. This created an ever-expanding web of accusations, as each coerced confession generated new suspects. Imagine the impossible choice faced by someone like Tituba, the enslaved woman whose initial confession helped launch the entire crisis. Faced with likely torture and certain execution if she maintained her innocence, she chose to weave an elaborate tale of devil worship, flying through the air and attending witch meetings. Her confession not only saved her life, but gave the authorities exactly what they wanted to hear, validating their belief that a vast supernatural conspiracy was indeed at work in Salem. The psychological pressure applied to extract these confessions was extraordinary. The accused were often held in deplorable conditions in overcrowded jails, sometimes for months, while awaiting trial. They were subjected to repeated interrogations, denied adequate food and comfort, and constantly reminded that confession offered their only hope of survival. Family members pleaded with their loved ones to confess, prioritizing life over truth. Some of the most heartbreaking cases involved individuals who initially maintained their innocence, but eventually broke under this relentless pressure. Mary Warren, one of the original accusers, who later tried to recant her testimony, found herself accused when she attempted to tell the truth. Under intense interrogation, she eventually returned to her role as an accuser, demonstrating how the system corrupted even those who tried to resist it. The trials also revealed how quickly neighbor could turn against neighbor when fear and suspicion took hold. People who had lived side by side for decades suddenly viewed each other with deep mistrust. Old grudges were reframed as evidence of supernatural malice. Property disputes became proof of diabolic revenge. Social tensions that had simmered beneath the surface for years erupted into life-and-death accusations. The case of Rebecca Nurse perfectly illustrates how even the most respected members of the community could fall victim to this madness. Nurse was a 71-year-old grandmother known throughout Salem Village for her piety and kindness. She had spent decades caring for the sick, helping with difficult childbirths, and serving as a moral anchor for her community. When she was accused of witchcraft, many of her neighbors were so shocked that they signed a petition defending her character. Yet even this sterling reputation couldn't protect her once the machinery of accusation began turning. The accusers claimed her specter had tormented them. Former patients and people she had helped were pressured to reinterpret her past kindnesses as supernatural manipulation. Her very virtues were twisted into evidence against her. Her piety became proof that she was skilled at hiding her true nature. Her knowledge of herbal remedies became evidence of supernatural healing powers. During her examination, Nurse's age and poor hearing worked against her. When she failed to respond quickly to questions or seemed confused by the proceedings, this was interpreted as further evidence of guilt. The accusers performed their usual theatrical displays, falling into fits and claiming her specter was attacking them even as she stood calmly before the court. Most chillingly, Nurse initially received a not guilty verdict from the jury, but Judge Stoughton was so displeased with this outcome that he sent the jury back to reconsider. Under pressure from the court, they changed their verdict to guilty. When Nurse was given one final chance to confess and save her life, she refused to admit to crimes she hadn't committed. She was executed on July 19, 1692, maintaining her innocence to the end. The treatment of Rebecca Nurse demonstrates how the Salem witch trials had created a system where innocence itself became a form of guilt. Those who confessed were spared, while those who maintained their innocence were condemned. Truth became irrelevant. Only the court's desire for validation mattered. This perversion of justice extended to the very youngest victims of the hysteria. Children as young as 4 years old were accused and imprisoned. Dorothy Good, the daughter of accused witch Sarah Good, was only 4 when she was arrested and jailed for months. The psychological trauma inflicted on these children was immense, yet the authorities showed no mercy based on age. The trials had created a monster that fed on fear and grew stronger with each execution. Every hanging validated the judge's belief that they were engaged in a righteous battle against supernatural evil. Every confession confirmed their suspicions about the extent of the diabolic conspiracy. The system had become self-perpetuating, generating its own evidence and justifying its own existence through the very destruction it caused. As summer turned to fall in 1692, Salem had become a community where terror reigned supreme, where neighbor feared neighbor, and where the mere accusation of witchcraft could lead to death. The trials had revealed the darkest aspects of human nature, showing how quickly civilization could collapse when fear overcame reason, when authority abandoned justice, and when communities allowed hysteria to replace humanity. Welcome back, fellow history enthusiasts. Before we delve deeper into this dark chapter of American justice, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from tonight and what drew you to learn about these troubling events. Whether you're settling in for the evening or taking a break from your day, I'm grateful you've chosen to explore this sobering piece of our past with me. If you find value in these detailed examinations of historical injustice, please consider subscribing to join our community of curious minds. Now, let's continue our journey into the Salem witch trials, where we'll uncover how a combination of personal vendettas, social manipulation, and institutional failure created one of America's most shameful episodes. In our previous segments, we've seen how spectral evidence corrupted the legal system, how fear and hysteria consumed entire communities, and how coerced confessions became tools of oppression. But there's another crucial dimension to this tragedy that makes it even more disturbing than most people realize: the calculated use of witchcraft accusations as weapons in long-standing personal and political conflicts. The Salem witch trials weren't just a product of mass hysteria or religious extremism. They were, in many ways, the culmination of decades of simmering resentments, property disputes, and social tensions that had been festering beneath the surface of colonial Massachusetts life. What makes this particularly chilling is how certain individuals recognized the trials as an opportunity to settle old scores and eliminate rivals under the guise of rooting out evil. Consider the case of Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old woman whose family had been embroiled in a bitter land dispute with their neighbors, the Putnams, for over a generation. The conflict stretched back to the 1640s, when Rebecca's husband, Francis Nurse, had purchased a large tract of land that the Putnams believed rightfully belonged to them. For decades, this dispute had poisoned relations between the families, spawning lawsuits, arguments over property lines, and accusations of theft and fraud. When the witch trials began, it was Anne Putnam Sr. who first accused Rebecca Nurse of witchcraft, claiming that Nurse's spectre had tormented her and her daughter. But this wasn't a case of supernatural persecution. It was the weaponization of fear and superstition to destroy an enemy. The timing was no coincidence. Just months before the accusations began, the Nurse family had won yet another legal victory in their ongoing property dispute, further infuriating the Putnams. What followed was a systematic campaign to destroy not just Rebecca Nurse, but her entire family line. The accusations spread to include other members of the Nurse clan, creating a web of alleged witchcraft that threatened to eliminate the Putnams' rivals entirely. The tragic irony is that Rebecca Nurse was known throughout the community as a woman of exceptional piety and charity. Even some of Salem's most respected citizens testified to her good character, recognizing the accusations for what they truly were. But character witnesses meant nothing in a system that had abandoned rational evidence in favor of spectral testimony. When 39 of Salem's most prominent residents signed a petition defending Rebecca Nurse, it only served to expand the circle of suspicion. Several of the petition signers themselves soon found their loyalty questioned, and some faced accusations of their own. This pattern of using witchcraft accusations to settle personal grievances wasn't limited to the Nurse Putnam feud. Throughout Salem and the surrounding communities, the trials became a vehicle for resolving disputes that had nothing to do with supernatural evil. Property boundaries, business rivalries, marital conflicts, and social resentments all found expression through accusations of witchcraft. The case of Martha Corey illustrates another dimension of this calculated cruelty. Corey had made the fatal mistake of expressing skepticism about the initial accusations against Tituba and the other accused women. In a community gripped by fear, such skepticism was itself seen as evidence of guilt. How could an innocent person doubt the reality of witchcraft unless they were in league with the devil themselves? Martha Corey's husband, Giles, initially supported the accusations against his wife, perhaps hoping to distance himself from suspicion. But as the trials progressed and he witnessed their fundamental injustice, he began to speak out against the proceedings. This change of heart would cost him his life in one of the most brutal executions in American history. When Giles Corey was himself accused of witchcraft, he refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. Under English common law, this meant he could not be tried, but it also meant he could be subjected to peine forte et dure, being pressed to death under heavy stones until he either entered a plea or died. The authorities hoped that the agony would force Corey to cooperate, allowing them to proceed with a trial and the inevitable execution. For 2 days, the 80-year-old man endured unimaginable torture as more and more stones were piled upon his chest. Witnesses reported that his only words during this ordeal were "more weight," a defiant refusal to give his torturers the satisfaction of his cooperation. Giles Corey died without entering a plea, becoming the only person in American history to be pressed to death. But even this horrific execution served a calculated purpose beyond simple punishment. Under the law, if Corey had been convicted of witchcraft, his property would have been forfeited to the crown. By refusing to plead and dying under torture rather than by execution, he ensured that his lands would pass to his heirs rather than be seized by the government. In his final act, Giles Corey outsmarted the system that had murdered his wife and sought to destroy his family's legacy. The targeting of the Corey family reveals another disturbing aspect of the Salem trials: the way accusations could spread through social networks, creating cascading waves of suspicion that destroyed entire communities. Once someone was accused, their family members, friends, and associates all became potential targets. The trials created a vicious cycle where each new accusation generated more suspects, and each execution created more grieving relatives who might themselves become threats to the accusers. This expansion of suspicion was particularly devastating for Salem's social fabric because it turned the normal bonds of community into sources of danger. Friendship became suspicious. Why would someone defend the accused unless they shared their guilt? Family loyalty was seen as potential evidence of a witch's coven. Even acts of charity and kindness could be reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural manipulation. The case of Sarah Good exemplifies how social prejudice and personal animosity merged with witchcraft accusations to destroy the most vulnerable members of society. Good was a homeless beggar who wandered through Salem asking for food and shelter. Her poverty and desperate circumstances had made her unwelcome in many homes, and she had developed a reputation for muttering curses when refused charity. When livestock died or children fell ill after Sarah Good had been turned away from their doors, it was easy for people to connect these misfortunes to her presence. But this wasn't supernatural causation. It was the scapegoating of a woman whose poverty and desperation made her an easy target for community frustrations. Sarah Good's fate was sealed not by any evidence of witchcraft, but by her status as an outsider with no one to defend her. The execution of Sarah Good on July 19, 1692, was accompanied by a moment that crystallized the trial's fundamental injustice. As she stood on the gallows, Reverend Nicholas Noyes declared that she knew she was a witch. Good's response has echoed through history. "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink. Whether Sarah Good intended it as a curse or simply a prediction of divine justice, her words proved prophetic. Reverend Noyes died 25 years later, choking on his own blood. But more significantly, her defiant final statement captured the moral clarity that had been so conspicuously absent from the trials themselves. In her last moments, this impoverished and friendless woman spoke truth to power with a courage that the educated ministers and magistrates of Salem had utterly failed to display. The systematic targeting of vulnerable populations reveals another layer of the trial's horror. Women like Sarah Good, who lacked social protection, were disproportionately likely to face accusations. So were those who had challenged social norms in other ways. Women who had inherited property, who had engaged in business, or who had otherwise stepped outside traditional gender roles. Bridget Bishop, the first person executed in the Salem trials, fit this pattern perfectly. She was a tavern keeper who dressed flamboyantly, had been married multiple times, and was known for her independent spirit. Her tavern was a place where men gathered to drink and gamble, activities that the Puritan community viewed with deep suspicion. When accusations of witchcraft began flying, Bridget Bishop's unconventional lifestyle made her an obvious target. The speed with which Bishop was tried and executed, just 8 days after the special court of Oyer and Terminer was established, suggests that her fate was predetermined. The authorities needed a quick conviction to establish the court's legitimacy and demonstrate their commitment to rooting out witchcraft. Bishop's reputation and lack of powerful allies made her the perfect first victim. But the targeting of social outsiders was only part of a broader pattern of how the trials reinforced existing power structures while appearing to challenge supernatural evil. The accusations consistently flowed upward from accusers of lower social status to targets of higher status, but they stopped well short of truly challenging the colony's elite. While several prosperous farmers and respected church members were accused, the colonial leadership itself remained largely untouched. This selective application of suspicion reveals the trial's true nature as a tool of social control rather than spiritual purification. The same magistrates who accepted spectral evidence without question when it targeted their social inferiors became suddenly skeptical when accusations began to threaten their own class. When the wife of Governor William Phipps was accused of witchcraft, the governor quickly dissolved the special court and ended the trials. The economic dimensions of the Salem witch trials add yet another layer of calculation to what appeared to be spiritual warfare. The seizure of accused witches' property created powerful financial incentives for certain accusations. While the property of executed witches was supposed to be forfeited to the crown, in practice, much of it ended up in the hands of local officials and their allies. The case of Philip English illustrates how economic motives could drive accusations against the wealthy. English was one of Salem's most prosperous merchants, with extensive shipping interests and substantial land holdings. When he and his wife were accused of witchcraft, they fled to New York rather than face trial. In their absence, local authorities seized their property, effectively destroying English's business empire. Years later, when English returned to Salem after the trials had ended, he found his warehouses emptied, his ships sold, and his lands occupied by others. The accusation of witchcraft had provided a convenient legal mechanism for redistributing his wealth to his competitors and rivals. English spent the rest of his life trying to recover his losses through the courts. But the colonial government showed little interest in compensating the victims of its judicial atrocity. The targeting of Philip English also reveals how accusations could be used to eliminate economic competition. Salem was a rapidly growing port town where merchants competed fiercely for trade routes and market share. The witch trials provided an opportunity for unscrupulous competitors to eliminate rivals by questioning their spiritual allegiance rather than competing fairly in the marketplace. This economic warfare through witchcraft accusations was particularly devastating because it was nearly impossible to defend against. How could someone prove they hadn't made a pact with the devil? How could they demonstrate that their business success came from legitimate enterprise rather than supernatural assistance? The burden of proof had been reversed, and innocence became impossible to establish. The psychological manipulation employed during the Salem trials reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this historical atrocity: the deliberate exploitation of human vulnerabilities to manufacture guilt and destroy lives. The accusers, particularly the group of young women whose fits and visions drove the initial panic, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate both their immediate audience and the broader community. The fits displayed by the accusers followed predictable patterns that maximized their dramatic impact. They would begin with subtle symptoms, feelings of being pinched or pricked, that gradually escalated to violent convulsions, temporary blindness, and apparent attempts at self-harm. These performances were timed to coincide with moments of maximum tension in the courtroom, particularly when the accused attempted to defend themselves. What made these performances so effective was their apparent spontaneity and the genuine distress they appeared to cause the accusers. But careful examination of the historical record reveals a level of coordination and calculation that suggests deliberate deception rather than supernatural affliction. The accusers would often mirror each other's symptoms, create new accusations together, and modify their stories in response to changing circumstances. The case of Mary Warren illustrates how this psychological manipulation could be turned against the accusers themselves when they threatened the larger narrative. Warren was initially one of the primary accusers, but she later recanted her testimony and claimed that the other girls had been lying. When she attempted to tell the truth, she found herself accused of witchcraft by her former allies. Under intense pressure and facing the possibility of execution, Warren was forced to recant her recantation and return to her role as an accuser. But her brief moment of honesty revealed the manufactured nature of the entire enterprise. The fact that the accusers could turn their supernatural afflictions on and off depending on political necessity exposed the fraudulent foundation of the entire proceedings. The psychological pressure applied to the accused was equally calculated and devastating. The interrogation techniques used by the magistrates were designed to break down resistance and force confessions, regardless of guilt or innocence. Accused witches were subjected to hours of relentless questioning, often while physically restrained and deprived of food and sleep. The questions themselves were crafted to create logical traps from which there was no escape. If someone denied being a witch, they were accused of lying and obstinacy. If they confessed, they were required to name accomplices, spreading the web of accusations ever wider. If they remained silent, their silence was taken as evidence of guilt. The interrogation process was designed to produce the desired outcome regardless of the truth. The case of Tituba, the enslaved woman whose initial confession helped launch the Salem witch trials, demonstrates how this psychological manipulation could be used to extract detailed false confessions. Under intense pressure and probably physical abuse, Tituba provided elaborate descriptions of her alleged dealings with the devil, complete with details about other witches in the community and their supernatural activities. But Tituba's confession, while it may have saved her life temporarily, also provided the template for all subsequent accusations. Her descriptions of devil worship, spectral attacks, and supernatural meetings became the standard narrative that other accused witches were expected to confirm. Those who deviated from this script or denied their guilt were seen as particularly dangerous and unrepentant. The role of children in the Salem witch trials adds another layer of horror to this historical atrocity. Young accusers like 11-year-old Abigail Williams and 9-year-old Ann Putnam Jr. were not just witnesses to the proceedings. They were weaponized by adults who understood how to exploit their youth and apparent innocence to lend credibility to otherwise incredible accusations. The adults who coached and encouraged these child accusers bear responsibility for one of history's most cynical manipulations of childhood innocence. By placing children at the center of the accusations, the authorities created a situation where questioning the evidence meant questioning the word of innocent children who claimed to be suffering supernatural torment. But these children were not acting independently. They were embedded in adult networks of rivalry and resentment that guided their accusations toward specific targets. Ann Putnam Jr.'s accusations consistently aligned with her family's economic and social interests, suggesting that her supernatural visions were heavily influenced by adult guidance and suggestion. The long-term psychological damage inflicted on these child accusers is difficult to measure, but the historical record suggests that many struggled with guilt and trauma for the rest of their lives. Ann Putnam Jr. was the only accuser who ever publicly apologized for her role in the trials, acknowledging in 1706 that she had been deluded by Satan and asking forgiveness from the families of those she had helped condemn. But by then, the damage was irreversible. 20 people were dead, countless families were destroyed, and an entire community had been traumatized by an episode that revealed the darkest possibilities of human nature when fear overcomes reason and justice becomes a tool of oppression. The Salem witch trials represent more than just a historical curiosity or an example of past superstition. They provide a chilling blueprint for how rational societies can descend into madness when certain conditions align, when fear overwhelms critical thinking, when institutions abandon their protective functions, when personal grievances masquerade as moral crusades, and when the vulnerable become scapegoats for broader social anxieties. The techniques of manipulation, coercion, and scapegoating employed in Salem have been replicated throughout history in different contexts and with different targets. The fundamental dynamics, the manufacture of evidence, the reversal of the burden of proof, the exploitation of fear and prejudice, the use of children as weapons, and the systematic targeting of the powerless appear again and again in humanity's darkest chapters. What makes the Salem witch trials particularly disturbing is not just their immediate horror, but their demonstration of how quickly and completely a community can abandon its moral foundations when gripped by fear and manipulated by those who understand how to exploit that fear for their own purposes. The transition from a functioning, if imperfect, legal system to a machinery of judicial murder happened in a matter of months, suggesting that the protections we often take for granted are far more fragile than we might like to believe. As we reflect on this dark chapter of American history, we must remember that it was not the product of ignorance or primitiveness, but of deliberate choices made by educated people who understood exactly what they were doing. The magistrates who accepted spectral evidence knew it was unreliable. The ministers who encouraged the trials understood they were violating biblical principles of justice. The accusers who pointed fingers at their neighbors were often settling personal scores rather than identifying supernatural threats. The Salem witch trials were worse than most people realize, not because of their scale or their brutality, though both were significant, but because of their demonstration that ordinary people in ordinary communities are capable of extraordinary evil when the right conditions emerge. They remind us that the price of justice is eternal vigilance, and that the protection of the innocent requires constant courage from those willing to speak truth to power, even when that truth is unwelcome and dangerous. In our modern world, where fear and division continue to threaten rational discourse and just institutions, the lessons of Salem remain painfully relevant. The techniques of manipulation and scapegoating have evolved, but their essential characteristics remain the same. The only defense against such darkness is an unwavering commitment to evidence-based reasoning, procedural justice, and the protection of the vulnerable, principles that the people of Salem abandoned to their eternal shame and our enduring instruction. The true horror of the Salem witch trials lies not in what they tell us about the past, but in what they reveal about the human capacity for self-deception and cruelty when fear is allowed to triumph over justice. They serve as a permanent warning about the fragility of civilization and the constant vigilance required to protect the innocent from those who would exploit fear for their own dark purposes. Here's part 10 of the 12-part script for Boring History. Why the Salem witch trials were worse than you thought. What made the Salem witch trials truly terrifying wasn't just the individual cases of injustice, or even the systematic breakdown of legal protections. It was how the entire community became complicit in what can only be described as a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare that turned neighbor against neighbor, parent against child, and husband against wife, in ways that would have lasting effects for generations. The psychological manipulation began long before anyone was accused of witchcraft. The Puritan community in Salem had been primed for paranoia through decades of sermons about Satan's presence in their daily lives. Ministers like Cotton Mather had spent years conditioning the population to see the devil's hand in every misfortune, every unexplained illness, every crop failure. This wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate strategy to maintain social control through fear. Consider how the accusation process actually worked. It wasn't random. The afflicted girls didn't just point fingers willy-nilly. They were coached, encouraged, and rewarded for their performances. Each time they accused someone, they received attention, sympathy, and power they had never experienced before. These were young women in a society that gave them virtually no agency, and suddenly they held the power of life and death over adults. The psychological profiles of the accusers reveal a disturbing pattern. Many came from broken homes, had experienced trauma, or were social outcasts themselves. Mercy Lewis had watched her parents die in an Indian raid. Abigail Williams was an orphan living with her uncle. These weren't malicious masterminds. They were damaged children who had been weaponized by adults with their own agendas. But the most chilling aspect was how the community eagerly participated in the destruction of their neighbors. This wasn't a case of a few bad actors manipulating an innocent population. The Salem witch trials succeeded because the community wanted them to succeed. People had grievances, resentments, and jealousies that had been festering for years, and the witch trials provided the perfect opportunity to settle scores while appearing righteous. Take the case of Martha Corey, one of the most devastating examples of how the trials tore families apart. Martha was a church member, known for her piety and good works, but she made one fatal mistake. She expressed skepticism about the witch trials. When her own husband, Giles Corey, was pressed for information about her behavior, he provided testimony that would lead to her execution. Later, when Giles himself was accused, he realized the horror of what he had done, but it was too late. The economic motivations were equally sinister. When someone was accused of witchcraft, their property was often seized. Families could lose everything overnight. This created a perverse incentive structure, where accusation became a form of economic warfare. Thomas Putnam, whose daughter was one of the primary accusers, had land disputes with numerous people who were later accused of witchcraft. Coincidence? Hardly. The trials also served as a tool of social engineering. The majority of those accused were women, particularly women who didn't conform to Puritan expectations. Widows who inherited property, women who spoke out in church, midwives who had knowledge of herbs and healing, women who were too independent or too outspoken. The witch trials were, in many ways, a systematic campaign to eliminate women who threatened the patriarchal order. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how the trials created a culture of betrayal. The legal system was designed to reward those who confessed and accused others. This created a pyramid scheme of accusation, where survival depended on implicating more people. The more names you gave, the better your chances of avoiding execution. This incentive structure turned the entire community into a network of informants and betrayers. the psychological torture extended beyond the accused to their families and friends. Imagine being the child of someone accused of witchcraft. You faced an impossible choice: defend your parent and risk being accused yourself, or distance yourself and live with the guilt forever. Many families were torn apart by these impossible decisions. Children testified against parents, siblings turned on each other, and spouses abandoned their partners to save themselves. The role of spectral evidence cannot be overstated in understanding the psychological warfare of Salem. This was evidence based on dreams, visions, and supernatural claims that were impossible to disprove. How do you defend yourself against someone who claims your spirit visited them in their sleep and tormented them? This type of evidence created a Kafkaesque nightmare where innocence became impossible to prove. The afflicted girls' performances were carefully choreographed psychological theatre designed to create maximum emotional impact. They would scream, convulse, and claim to be tortured by invisible forces whenever the accused entered the courtroom. These performances were so convincing that even skeptical observers found themselves swayed. The girls had learned to manipulate the deepest fears and superstitions of their community with surgical precision. The witch trials also exploited existing social tensions and anxieties. Salem was a community under stress. They had recently experienced devastating Indian raids, political upheaval, and economic uncertainty. The witch trials provided a scapegoat for all these problems. Instead of addressing the real causes of their difficulties, the community could blame everything on Satan and his alleged servants. The speed with which the trials escalated reveals how quickly a civilized society can descend into barbarism when the right psychological conditions are present. Within months, a small group of accusations had mushroomed into a community-wide hysteria that consumed hundreds of people. This rapid escalation wasn't accidental. It was the result of deliberate decisions by those in power to fan the flames rather than contain them. The interrogation techniques used against the accused were sophisticated forms of psychological torture. Sleep deprivation, prolonged questioning, threats against family members, and promises of leniency in exchange for confession. These methods were designed to break down the psychological defenses of the accused and force them to admit to crimes they hadn't committed. Many confessions were obtained through these coercive tactics. The social dynamics of Salem also played a crucial role in the trial's success. The community was divided into factions, with long-standing disputes over land, church leadership, and social status. The witch trials became a way for one faction to eliminate their opponents while appearing to serve God. The accusations followed predictable patterns that aligned with these existing conflicts. The role of gender in the trials reveals the deeply misogynistic nature of the accusations. Women made up approximately 80% of those accused, and the vast majority of accusers were also female. This wasn't coincidental. In Puritan society, women were seen as more susceptible to Satan's influence and more likely to be tempted by witchcraft. The trials reinforced and amplified existing prejudices against women, particularly those who didn't conform to expected roles. The international context of the Salem witch trials is also important to understand. This wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader European witch craze that had been sweeping across the continent for centuries. The colonists brought these beliefs and practices with them from Europe, where tens of thousands of people had already been executed for witchcraft. Salem was simply the most extreme manifestation of these beliefs in the New World. The aftermath of the trials reveals the lasting psychological damage inflicted on the community. Families remained divided for generations. The economy was devastated as productive members of society were killed or fled. Trust between neighbors was permanently damaged. The social fabric of Salem was torn apart in ways that took decades to repair. if they ever truly were repaired. What makes the Salem witch trials particularly horrifying is how they demonstrate the ease with which ordinary people can be turned into instruments of persecution. The accusers weren't monsters. They were regular members of the community who became caught up in a system that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. The judges weren't evil overlords. They were respected members of society who allowed their prejudices and fears to override their judgment. The Salem witch trials also show how quickly legal protections can be abandoned when fear takes hold. Due process, the presumption of innocence, the right to legal representation, these fundamental principles of justice were cast aside in the name of fighting an imaginary threat. Once these protections were removed, the slide into tyranny was swift and devastating. The psychological legacy of Salem extends far beyond the immediate victims. The trials created a template for how fear could be weaponized against unpopular groups. They demonstrated how accusations alone could destroy lives, and how communities could be manipulated into participating in their own moral destruction. These lessons would be repeated throughout American history, from the Red Scares to McCarthyism, to modern moral panics. The Salem witch trials weren't just a historical curiosity or a cautionary tale about superstition. They were a masterclass in psychological manipulation, social control, and the systematic destruction of a community's moral foundation. They show us how quickly civilization can collapse when fear overcomes reason, when prejudice trumps justice, and when ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil. The most terrifying aspect of the Salem witch trials isn't that they happened 3 centuries ago, in a world we consider primitive and superstitious. It's how easily they could happen again. The psychological mechanisms that drove the trials, the fear, the scapegoating, the willingness to sacrifice others to protect ourselves, these are still present in human nature. The Salem witch trials serve as a permanent reminder of what we're capable of when we abandon our principles and surrender to our worst impulses. Understanding the psychological warfare of Salem isn't just about learning history, it's about recognizing the warning signs in our own time. When we see communities turning against vulnerable groups, when we see accusations without evidence being treated as fact, when we see fear being used to justify the abandonment of legal protections, we should remember Salem and ask ourselves whether we're witnessing the birth of a new witch trial. The victims of Salem deserve to be remembered not just as statistics or symbols, but as real people who suffered and died because their community failed them. They were tortured, executed, and destroyed by neighbors who knew them, judges who should have protected them, and a system that valued conformity over truth. Their deaths were not inevitable. They were the result of specific choices made by specific people who could have chosen differently. The Salem witch trials ended not because the community suddenly came to its senses, but because the accusations finally reached people with enough power and influence to fight back. When the wife of the governor was accused, when prominent ministers began to be targeted, only then did the authorities begin to question the system they had created. This reveals the class-based nature of the trials and how they were allowed to continue as long as they only targeted the vulnerable and powerless. Looking at your script summary and the reference materials, here's part 11 of your Salem witch trials series. Yet perhaps the most insidious aspect of the Salem witch trials was how they transformed ordinary neighbors into instruments of persecution. The trials didn't just rely on a handful of corrupt officials or zealous ministers. They weaponized the entire community against itself, turning everyday social tensions into matters of life and death. Consider the testimony patterns that emerged during the trials. Time and again, accusations followed predictable lines of existing conflict. Property disputes suddenly became evidence of supernatural malice. Economic rivalries transformed into proof of diabolic compacts. A failed business deal could become testimony that your competitor had cursed your endeavors through witchcraft. The case of Rebecca Nurse illustrates this dynamic perfectly. At 71 years old, Nurse was one of the most respected members of Salem village. She was known for her piety, her charitable works, and her gentle nature. When she was accused of witchcraft, 39 of her neighbors signed a petition defending her character. Yet even this overwhelming support couldn't save her from the machinery of accusation once it was set in motion. The accusation against Nurse stemmed from a land dispute between her family and the Putnams, one of the most powerful families in Salem village. For years, the two families had been locked in legal battles over property boundaries and inheritance rights. When the witch trials began, Ann Putnam Jr., the 12-year-old daughter of Thomas Putnam, claimed that Nurse's spectre had tortured her. Suddenly, a mundane property dispute had become a supernatural battle between good and evil. What made this transformation so devastating was how it inverted normal social relationships. In traditional Puritan society, age commanded respect, piety was valued above all else, and community standing mattered. But the witch trials created a new hierarchy where the youngest and most marginal members of society, teenage girls and servants, could wield power over their social superiors simply by claiming supernatural affliction. This inversion wasn't accidental. It reflected deep tensions within Puritan society about authority, gender, and social order. Young women, typically the most powerless members of the community, suddenly found themselves at the center of attention. Their words could determine life and death. Their accusations could topple the most established families. For perhaps the first time in their lives, they possessed real power, and some clearly relished wielding it. The afflicted girls quickly learned to perform their role with increasing sophistication. They developed a repertoire of symptoms that could be deployed on command, falling into fits at precisely the right moments, crying out against specific individuals when tensions reached their peak, even claiming to see invisible specters that only they could perceive. Their performances became more elaborate and coordinated over time, suggesting a level of conscious manipulation that went far beyond genuine religious hysteria. But the girls weren't operating in a vacuum. They were supported and encouraged by adults who had their own reasons for wanting certain individuals accused. Ministers like Samuel Parris used the trials to consolidate his authority and eliminate his critics. Wealthy families like the Putnams used accusations to settle old scores and acquire property. Even ordinary citizens found that supporting the trials could provide protection from suspicion while offering opportunities to advance their own interests. This created a feedback loop of escalating accusations. As more people were arrested, the pressure mounted on the accused to confess and name accomplices. Those who maintained their innocence faced almost certain death, while those who confessed and implicated others could often save their lives. The system incentivized false confessions and created an ever-expanding web of alleged conspirators. The confession of Tituba, Reverend Parris's slave from Barbados, established this dangerous precedent early in the trials. Facing certain execution if she maintained her innocence, Tituba instead provided exactly what her interrogators wanted to hear: a detailed account of witches' meetings, demonic animals, and supernatural plots against Salem. Her confession not only saved her life, but provided the template that other accused witches would follow. Yet even confession offered no guarantee of safety. The trials had taken on a momentum of their own, driven by fear, greed, and the intoxicating power of accusation. As the circle of suspicion widened, it began to encompass individuals who had previously considered themselves untouchable. When the wife of Governor William Phipps was accused of witchcraft, the governor finally recognized that the trials had spiraled completely out of control. The Salem witch trials reveal how quickly a community can descend into collective madness when fear overrides reason and when institutions abandon their responsibility to protect the innocent. They show us how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil, not through sudden moral collapse, but through a series of small compromises and rationalizations that gradually erode the foundations of justice and humanity. Most chillingly, they demonstrate how persecution can become self-sustaining, creating its own justification and momentum. Once the trials began, questioning them became dangerous. Defending the accused invited suspicion. The only safe position was enthusiastic support for the proceedings, which in turn legitimized and accelerated the persecution. The true horror of Salem wasn't just that innocent people died, but that an entire community convinced itself that this slaughter was not only justified, but necessary. They transformed murder into righteousness, paranoia into piety, and mob violence into divine justice. In doing so, they created a template for persecution that would echo through history, from the witch hunts of early modern Europe to the ideological purges of the 20th century. The legacy of Salem reminds us that the capacity for such collective delusion lies dormant in every society, waiting for the right combination of fear, authority, and opportunity to awaken it. The trials ended, not because people suddenly came to their senses, but because the machinery of persecution finally consumed someone too powerful to ignore. It was politics, not principle, that brought the madness to a halt. This is perhaps the most sobering lesson of Salem, that without constant vigilance and institutional safeguards, any community can slide into the abyss of persecution. The witch trials weren't an aberration, but a revelation. A glimpse into the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of civilized society, waiting for the right moment to emerge and consume the innocent. Looking at the script content you've provided and the reference files, I'll continue with part 12 of Boring History. Why the Salem witch trials were worse than you thought, in the established tone and style. The reverberations of the Salem witch trials extend far beyond the boundaries of 17th century Massachusetts, serving as a chilling reminder of humanity's capacity for collective madness and the terrifying ease with which rational thought can be abandoned in favor of fear-driven hysteria. The events of 1692 and 1693 represent more than just a historical footnote about superstition and injustice. They constitute a blueprint for understanding how civilized societies can rapidly descend into chaos when fundamental principles of justice, evidence, and human dignity are cast aside. What makes Salem particularly disturbing is not merely the scale of the accusations or the tragic death toll, but the systematic nature of the breakdown. This wasn't random violence or spontaneous mob action. It was institutionalized persecution carried out through the very mechanisms designed to protect the innocent. The courts, the clergy, the community leaders, and even ordinary citizens all participated in a machine of destruction that fed on fear and grew stronger with each accusation. The trials revealed how quickly the presumption of innocence could be reversed, how easily the burden of proof could be shifted to the accused, and how readily a community could turn against its most vulnerable members. The psychological manipulation that characterized the Salem trials offers profound insights into the human condition and our susceptibility to mass hysteria. The accusers, many of them young women in a rigidly patriarchal society, discovered that their testimony held unprecedented power. Through claims of spectral evidence and supernatural torment, they could command the attention of magistrates, ministers, and the entire community. Their fits and convulsions became performances that determined life and death, creating a perverse theater where the most dramatic accusations carried the greatest weight. This dynamic reveals how easily social hierarchies can be upended when fear overwhelms reason, and how those typically powerless can become instruments of destruction when given the authority to level accusations that cannot be disproven. The role of social and economic tensions in fueling the accusations cannot be overstated. Salem Village was a community riven by disputes over land ownership, ministerial authority, and economic opportunities. Families who had feuded for generations found in the witch trials a convenient mechanism for settling old scores. Property disputes that had simmered for decades suddenly became matters of spiritual warfare, with accusations of witchcraft serving as weapons in conflicts that had nothing to do with supernatural evil. The pattern of accusations clearly reflected these underlying tensions, with many of the accused being individuals who had previously been involved in legal disputes, property disagreements, or social conflicts with their accusers or their families. Perhaps most troubling is how the trials exploited and reinforced existing prejudices against women, the elderly, the poor, and social outcasts. The majority of those accused were women, particularly those who didn't conform to Puritan ideals of feminine behavior. Widows who had inherited property, women who spoke out against authority, those who practiced folk healing, or simply individuals who had gained a reputation for being difficult or unconventional found themselves particularly vulnerable to accusations. The trials thus served as a mechanism for enforcing social conformity and punishing those who challenged established norms, using the ultimate sanction, death, to silence dissent and difference. The abandonment of established legal principles during the Salem trials demonstrates how quickly centuries of jurisprudential development can be swept away when fear takes hold. The acceptance of spectral evidence, testimony about dreams, visions, and supernatural encounters, represented a fundamental rejection of empirical standards of proof. Confessions extracted through psychological pressure, physical discomfort, and the promise of leniency were accepted as reliable evidence, despite their obvious unreliability. The normal protections afforded to the accused were systematically dismantled, creating a legal framework designed not to determine guilt or innocence, but to validate predetermined conclusions about supernatural evil. The community's participation in the trials reveals the disturbing power of collective action in amplifying individual prejudices and fears. Neighbors who might have harbored private doubts about their fellow citizens found themselves swept up in a communal effort to identify and eliminate supposed threats. The act of accusation became a form of social participation, a way of demonstrating one's own virtue and orthodoxy by identifying the evil in others. This dynamic created a snowball effect where each new accusation made subsequent accusations more likely. As the community became invested in validating its previous decisions and maintaining the narrative that had justified so much suffering, the economic incentives that drove the trials forward add another layer of cynicism to an already dark chapter. The property of the accused could be seized to pay for their imprisonment and trial costs, creating a perverse financial motivation for prolonging the proceedings. Accusers sometimes benefited directly from the destruction of their targets, inheriting property, or eliminating economic competition. The sheriff and other officials profited from the fees associated with arrests, imprisonments, and executions. This web of economic interests ensured that the trials continued even as doubts began to emerge about their legitimacy and effectiveness. The role of religious authority in legitimizing and perpetuating the trials demonstrates how spiritual leaders can become complicit in persecution when they allow theological certainty to override compassion and critical thinking. Ministers who should have been voices of reason and mercy instead provided biblical justification for the proceedings, interpreting the trials as part of a cosmic battle between good and evil. Their sermons and writings created a theological framework that made questioning the trials tantamount to siding with Satan himself. This religious sanction gave the trials a sacred character that made opposition seem not just foolish but blasphemous. The eventual collapse of the trials occurred not through any sudden outbreak of rationality or compassion, but through the gradual recognition that the accusations had gone too far and were threatening individuals too prominent to be safely destroyed. When the accusations began to reach the wives of ministers and the relatives of magistrates, the community suddenly discovered the importance of standards of evidence and due process. This selective application of justice reveals the fundamentally political nature of the trials and their role in reinforcing rather than challenging existing power structures. The aftermath of Salem was marked by a complex mixture of acknowledgement and denial that continues to characterize how societies deal with episodes of collective wrongdoing. While some participants eventually expressed remorse and sought forgiveness, many others remained silent or attempted to justify their actions. The community's efforts to move past the trials often involved minimizing their significance or portraying them as an unfortunate but understandable response to extraordinary circumstances. This pattern of partial acknowledgement and defensive rationalization would be repeated in numerous subsequent episodes of mass persecution and injustice. The lessons of Salem extend far beyond the specific context of 17th century New England witch trials. They illuminate the universal human tendency to seek simple explanations for complex problems, to find scapegoats for societal tensions, and to use fear as a tool for achieving political and social objectives. The trials demonstrate how quickly civilized societies can abandon their most cherished principles when confronted with perceived threats, and how easily the machinery of justice can be turned into an instrument of oppression. The relevance of Salem to contemporary society is both obvious and unsettling. The dynamics that drove the witch trials, fear of the other, the power of accusation in social media age, the temptation to abandon due process in times of crisis, the exploitation of genuine grievances for political gain, remain powerful forces in modern life. The trials serve as a warning about the fragility of the institutions and norms that protect individual rights and the constant vigilance required to maintain them. They remind us that the capacity for collective madness and systematic injustice lies dormant in every society, waiting to be awakened by the right combination of fear, prejudice, and opportunism. Understanding Salem requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and social organization. The trials were not the product of a uniquely superstitious or backward society, but rather the result of universal human tendencies that exist in every community and every era. The people of Salem were not monsters or primitive fanatics. They were ordinary individuals who allowed fear to override their better judgment and who participated in collective action that they would later struggle to explain or justify. Their experience serves as a mirror in which we can see our own capacity for both cruelty and wisdom, our vulnerability to manipulation, and our potential for moral courage. The true horror of Salem lies not in the supernatural elements that captivated the imaginations of the participants, but in the entirely human processes that transformed a community into a machine for destroying its own members. The trials represent a complete breakdown of the social contracts and moral constraints that make civilized life possible, replaced by a system that rewarded cruelty, punished virtue, and elevated fear above reason. They demonstrate how quickly the bonds that hold societies together can dissolve when tested by crisis, and how difficult it can be to rebuild trust and justice once they have been destroyed. As we reflect on the Salem witch trials more than 3 centuries after their conclusion, we must resist the temptation to view them as relics of a more primitive past, or as problems that modern enlightenment has rendered obsolete. The forces that drove the trials, fear, prejudice, the desire for simple answers to complex problems, the appeal of belonging to a righteous cause, remain as powerful today as they were in 1692. The challenge for every generation is to recognize these forces when they emerge, and to have the courage to resist them before they gain the momentum that makes them unstoppable. The legacy of Salem is ultimately one of warning and instruction. It teaches us that liberty and justice are not natural states, but artificial constructs that require constant maintenance and defense. It reminds us that the price of freedom is not just eternal vigilance against external enemies, but also constant self-examination and the willingness to confront the darkness within our own communities and ourselves. The victims of Salem died not just from rope and crushing stones, but from the failure of their neighbors to maintain the moral and intellectual standards that might have saved them. Their memory challenges us to do better, to be better, and to ensure that their suffering was not in vain. In the end, the Salem witch trials stand as a testament to both the worst and best of human nature. They reveal our capacity for cruelty, our susceptibility to delusion, and our tendency to destroy what we should protect. But they also demonstrate the power of individual conscience, the possibility of redemption, and the ultimate triumph of truth over falsehood. The trials ended not because evil was defeated or good triumphed, but because enough people finally found the courage to say that the emperor had no clothes, that the accusations were false, and that the community had lost its way. In their courage to speak truth to power and their willingness to acknowledge error, we find hope that reason and compassion can ultimately prevail over fear and hatred, even in the darkest of times.